I am Scott Lanyon. My role here at the university, I'm Vice Provost and Dean of Graduate Education. I'm also a professor in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior. I study actually bird evolution. That was what I was focused on. Um, so today you were sent a PDF with these slides. I encourage you to take a look at that, maybe make notes on that. But hopefully this is an opportunity for you just to listen to what I have to say and to ask whatever questions you have. This is designed around the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship proposal program. Um, that's because that is the single external fellowship that the largest number of graduate students at the university get for. However, I do want to note that most I'm going to tell you really is relevant to any fellowship proposal that you write. And indeed, I encourage you to write multiples. So even if you're knowing you're going to apply for an NSF, once you've started a developer proposal for NSF, I encourage you to be looking for other opportunities as well. And we can talk about that. I think in general, the kinds of comments that I have are relevant for a variety of fellowship opportunities. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So the way I've structured this, I'm going to make some introductory statements that are more general about how to get started on a fellowship proposal. The bulk of this will be about the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship proposal and the various elements of that proposal. And then finally, I'll conclude with some general writing recommendations, both for this purpose, but just for your grant proposal writing generally. So a good place to start is that you really want to make sure you have current information about the opportunity that you're pursuing. You probably have colleagues who, in this case, have applied for NSF in years or a different fellowship that you're going to apply for. It's great to talk to them in sites, but don't assume that what they know about the rules and eligibility and all the details of the opportunity are still true. Regulations change these things every year to some extent, so make sure you're looking at the current guidelines and that you know that you're up to date on this. So I've included here the website for the NSF opportunity. The other thing is that you should always have a sense of what success looks like. And so to help you with we've assembled in Canvas an archive of previously funded proposals for NSF and some other fellowship opportunities as well. It's really important that you have a sense of what a successful proposal might look like. However, if you look at those, make sure you're looking at more than one proposal, not just necessarily one from your own discipline, just so you get an idea of the range of styles that are used, okay? And the way you would do that is, there's a URL here, you can click on that, and that'll bring up this online form for you to complete. It will actually give you an opportunity to fill this out. It's actually, you're signing a confidentiality agreement, because the only reason we have these proposals is that students agreed to share them with you, other U of M students, understanding that you wouldn't be sharing these with anybody, okay? So don't share the proposal, don't share the content or the ideas. You're really looking at this just to see how to write a successful proposal. Sure. I encourage you to do that. It's really hard to be successful if you don't know what success looks like, and this is the best opportunity to do that. The other thing, again, this is about NSF, but I encourage you to be thinking about other opportunities, and on the website at this URL identifies a number of fellowship opportunities that you might be eligible for. And The library actually has a resource you have access to where you can do a search on for grants generally or fellowship specifically. And there are lots of different opportunities. Some of them are very specific to specific disciplines, which is why I don't cover them here. But I encourage you to take a look at that. Once you've started writing a fellowship proposal, it's frequently that difficult to then modify that and submit it to yet another funder. So please give that serious thought. Okay, so let's talk really about the NSF. One of the really interesting things for a lot of students who are first thinking about this is that this is a program to fund you as an individual and your potential as a scholar. It's not about a research project. Yes, there's a research project that you have to propose as part of this. That is not that's not what they're funding, all right? NSF, if they're funding you, you are actually not required to do the research that you describe in your graduate research plan statement, all right? So using that statement as a way to convince them of your potential as a scholar, but ultimately the decision is to fund you. And then which research you do, that's flexible. And the reason I wanted to point that out is that I think some students, especially if you're really early in your career, they feel really pressured when doing a fellowship proposal like this to come up with the dissertation project that they're due. That's not what this is about. It should be a project you're very interested in, obviously, because it's easier to write a convincing proposal about that. But don't feel the pressure that you're obligated to do what you say in this proposal if you choose not to, if you choose to go in a different direction. Okay. So the components of the NSF program are here. There really are these major options, the personal statement, the graduate research plan statement that I just mentioned, letters from your references, and academic transcripts. And I want to sort of give you an overview of this. I think students generally assume that the most important part of the proposal is the research statement. Given that this is NSF, that makes some sense. And so students frequently spend 90% of their effort on this component and just deal with the others as they have time. And I'm telling you, that would be a big mistake. The reality is that probably the most important single element, it's all important, of course, but the single most important element is in fact the personal statement. And it's for a very simple reason. What you see here from left to right is the sequence in which the files are assembled and in the sequence in which reviewers read them. So we read the personal statement first, all right? And so there are really two paths this can go. You can, as a reviewer, I read these statements and if I think it's great, I really like the statement, then I'm really hoping that the rest of the proposal is just as good. Basically, I'm already a fan. However, conversely, if I read that personal statement and it's not very good, it's not inspiring, maybe even boring or poorly written, then my attitude is, do I really have to keep reading this? And so at this point, when I'm done reading the personal statement, I've either already decided I really hope that the rest is good enough that I can recommend funding, or I've already decided that I'm not going to recommend funding, period. I've never recommended funding a proposal if after reading the personal statement, I was really unimpressed, okay? So it really is very important to spend time in the personal. I also stress that because most of you are comfortable writing research style statements, or else you wouldn't be in graduate school, right? You've already done a variety of research things as an undergrad or maybe as a master's student. Sort of academic writing you've become somewhat more comfortable with. Many people are very uncomfortable writing personally, writing the personal statement. And so that's another reason to stress why it's important for you to spend some time on that. Okay, so the next piece of advice is to make sure that you've really thought about who you're writing for, who the audience is. And I would say the most common mistake in all forms of writing is for people to start writing without first developing that understanding of their audience. Who's the audience? What's their motivations? What's their background? All those kinds of things. If you don't think about that actively, it's very difficult to write convincingly and effectively. So one way to think about that for NSF, with NSF, you're going to be asked as you go through the process of getting ready to apply to identify your primary field. And so what you see on this slide is a list of the major headings: chemistry, computer and information science, engineering, and so on. Then if you click on any one of them, as I chemistry, you'll see these subcategories. And so you identify these as you apply. And that actually, in doing that, identifies the set of reviewers who will be reviewing your proposal. So sometimes, some foundations, when you apply for a fellowship, you could have your proposal read by anybody. It could be people from all kinds of different backgrounds. With NSF, you're going to get somebody who's generally in your area. So who are the reviewers? I encourage you to think about it as being anybody, ranging from a specialist in your specific area to somebody in the discipline, but who really is unfamiliar with the questions and methodologies of the area you're working in. So one way to think about this is, imagine that your readers are going to include one person who's actually from your committee, so somebody who's really now familiar with your area, and then a faculty member in your graduate program who's least familiar with your kind of research. That's sort of the range of reviewers you're likely to have with NSF. All right. So if it helps you to think that way, that's the range. And then your job is to figure out how to write a proposal that both of those readers would find exciting. All right. So you're emphasizing the big picture, the questions that you're interacting with, that you're investigating, that would appeal to as broad as possible. All right. So Tony, you've asked a couple of questions. General timeline for applying for graduate postdoctorate. So the NSF typically, the announcement will go out. You'll need to check on the updated site, usually in August, and the proposals are due usually the end of October, early November. Other foundations, it varies around the calendar, so you really have to look at each particular option. What should I avoid when applying for funding? I think maybe let me continue this presentation. Maybe I will have answered that. Otherwise, whoever asked that, you might clarify what you're thinking in asking that question. How formal should my tone be in the application? So I'll get to a portion of this. Remember, there are these two statements that you're writing. One is the research statement. That's going to be really a typical academic writing, the way you've been taught in your discipline. It's going to be pretty formal. The personal statement is entirely different, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. What makes a strong applicant? Publications leadership, all of the above. I think that let's see, how do I answer that question? The questioner asked about publications. That varies dramatically by discipline. Some disciplines, frankly, it's expected that graduate students, even first-year graduates, already have a publication or two. In others, that expectation, aren't expected to have a publication towards the end of your graduate career. So it's highly discipline dependent. One way to get at the answer, one way to answer this question is take a look at that archive to who was funded, and that may actually help you to some extent in answering that. There was another question about interdisciplinary proposals. So you have the option of identifying both a primary field and a secondary field. And if those are very different, then NSF will arrange for you to have reviewers from both of those disciplines. Now, I have a caution for you here. If you're doing research that is 90%, well, even 75% in one discipline, but you have an element from another discipline, my general advice is just primary discipline. And the reason for that is that as soon as you have reviewers from multiple backgrounds, then you need to have written, and this is really about your research statement, you need to have written at a level that appeal to both of those very different disciplines. And that is a very difficult thing to do, to convince two experts that you are well-grounded in both disciplines and know the methodologies of both disciplines and so on. So it's a difficulty with interdisciplinarity. Now, if you really are in a situation of interdisciplinary scholarship and it's 50-50, then I think you do have to go the route of identifying these two different disciplines and getting reviewers from each. I'm going to talk about reviewers. There's another question about reviewers, whether they're just two. They're actually going to be three. You'll have three reviewers, but about that in a moment. So let me proceed, but keep the questions coming in. That's great. Appreciate that. So I said it's important to know who your reviewers are. It's also kind of important for you to identify with the reviewers and understand what they're doing when they're reviewing your paper. They are not sitting on a beach, relaxed, reviewing this. It's much more like this, right? The reviewers are people like me, administrators, they're faculty. They could be scholars, scientists in industry, although most tend to be from academia. We get these proposals to review in late December at the end of a semester when we're doing final, or over holiday break when we're preparing for the next semester and so on. So people are doing this on top of their regular job. Everybody's overloaded. So people are not going to be spending a huge amount of time with your proposal. And so your job is to make it really easy for them to like what you've written and to see your potential. Typically, I think many people take between 15, 20 minutes to read a proposal. So they're also reading it through probably just once. So you can't in such a way that they actually click through to make sure that they got all the information. So let me stop here and just summarize this section. This section, basically, I talked about the structure. There are these major elements: the personal statement, research statement, reference letters, and then your academic transcripts. I think the all aspects are important, of course, but the personal statement is critically important because it sets the stage for how people feel about your proposal generally, because that's what they read first. There are, I think somehow I missed going over this, but there are two criteria that will be used when evaluating proposal, and I'll talk about both of these, but there's intellectual merit and broader impacts. And to be effective here, you have to know your audience. So I've given you a way of understanding the audience for NSF, but for other fellowships, you really should try to find out who the are. They won't, you can't find out who the individuals are, but you could contact a foundation that is offering a fellowship and ask them to tell you something about the kind of backgrounds that the reviewers have, and most foundations will tell you that. You could also talk to your own faculty in your department, because in many cases, they're serving as reviewers for various foundations. Okay, so more questions here. I transferred graduate institution after my first include the research done there. I'm going to talk about the personal statement in more depth in just a moment. The quick answer is you want to provide in your personal statement the strongest set of experiences that explain why you're in graduate school. And in most cases, if you transferred from another graduate institution, I assume you have some experiences there that mentioning, and let me talk about that in just a moment. Let's come back to the methodology question. That's on the research statement. How do you describe concrete future plans when you yourself are unsure of what that means in your academic career? Again, this is part of the personal statement. The answer here is one, this is a good opportunity to say, you should be honest in your writing. So if you are uncertain, that's not necessarily a bad thing. You're here at the start of your graduate career. I would be inclined to describe the range of things that you're considering and why you're considering them. And let's come back to that. How can I sound convincing and not overconfident? That's an excellent one. And the quick answer to that, and I will talk about this as well, is that it's really important when you're writing to have other people read your writing. And that's one of the questions you can ask, or maybe you don't even have to ask it. You can just get feedback from people. But it's very hard to critique something like that, whether you're sounding overconfident or coming on being bold enough in your statements. It's hard to assess that of your own writing. You read somebody else. And so most of us are shy about sharing our writing with people. All I can tell you is you need to get over that. It's very hard to be successful trying to write in a vacuum without some feedback. So I encourage you to develop a thick skin about asking for feedback and using that feedback. So let me go on and let's talk about, a lot of these questions really are about the personal statement. This is a key component. You're talking about the relevant background, your future goals, and so on. And the most important thing here, and I can't stress this enough, is that your personal statement has to be personal. That may seem like a silly statement, but many people, because you're familiar with academic writing, tend to write in the third person, for example, and leave out emotion, frankly. The personal statement, you need to write first person, then there needs to be emotion in there. It needs to be a great personal statement is one that by the end of reading it, I would like to meet the person, right? Just that I think this person has potential to be a successful scholar, but that I'm getting to know the person just in those 3 pages. So let's talk about that. We all have a tremendous number of life experiences, and there's way too much to put into each statement. So one of the challenges is to figure out what to include. And the first thing I want to point out is that there may be many aspects of your life that are critically important to you, but that don't actually have much to do with the fact that you're in graduate school. Those are not things to include in the personal statement. The personal statement should help us basically answer the question, why are you in graduate school in this discipline? You need to help the reviewer understand that you've made a conscious decision to pursue a degree in this particular discipline. Why is that? So it could be courses that you took that were instrumental in helping you make that decision, that were really could be courses that you taught. Maybe you had an opportunity as an undergrad or as a master's student to do some teaching, to do a TA. Could be obviously research experience. Could be a personal tragedy that may have actually influenced your decision to pursue this particular degree and career path. Could be your personal experience communicating your scholarship to other individuals. Could be a travel experience. Could be almost anything. So it's really about thinking through how you would answer the question. If I asked you this question, why are you in grad school? what is it about your life? What are the events in your life, the major events in your life that help explain your decision to pursue a graduate degree? Okay, those are the kinds of things that should be in a personal statement. What shouldn't be there? We're not interested in reading about the really impressive people you worked in. So you worked in the lab of a Nobel laureate. I don't need to read about that. I don't want you to be telling me a lot about the faculty member you worked with and so on, or necessarily about the earth-shattering nature of the research you were involved with. Okay, I don't want to read just a set of dry, listing of things you've done in your life. Right? It should be a narrative. It should be you're telling a story. Instead, we're interested in how the things you've done have affected you and led you to pursue this graduate degree. All right. This is all about you, not about the person you worked with. Yes, we're interested in hearing about some of the research you were involved with, but we're interested in what you learned from that research, how you intellectually and emotionally, in maturity and so on, as a result of that experience. The nature of the research itself is only relevant to help us understand the skills that you might have picked up. Okay. So there's a question here about whether the personal statement is different from the personal statement you wrote for PhD patients. I can tell you, we're doing this as a workshop today, but for a number of years before I became dean, I taught a semester-long course in fellowship proposal writing for the NSF. And one of the common comments from students was that they were, after writing their NSF personal statement, they were embarrassed to go back and read the statement they submitted to get into graduate school. So my advice to you is, as you think about writing your NSF, don't start with what you submitted for graduate school, even though obviously that was successful. Try writing it from scratch, from the beginning. Just start over. And then once you're further along, you could always go back to what you had submitted to grad school, and there may be elements there that you like better, and so fine, use those. But if you start from something you've already written, it's amazing how constraining that is. It's very hard to think outside the box when you have something on paper or electronically already. Basically, it's quickly get into just editing what you already have rather than truly thinking about different ways of presenting things. There was a question about international students. International students are not eligible for the NSF program, but there are other awards that you could apply for. And again, I suggest you look for those on the grad school website or on the library. Another question is whether it's not helpful to name drop. Name dropping is fine. That's perfectly fine. But it should be in the context still about you. What I'm referring to is, I have read proposals where an entire paragraph describes this fabulous faculty researcher and the research program that faculty member is doing without ever once mentioning the student. That's what I think you need to avoid. I think saying that you had this research experience in this person's lab is fine, but it's just, you're just mentioning it in passing. Okay. Last thing I wanted to mention in this context is that some of these life experiences that might be really impactful and explain why you're in graduate school might seem negative. So a prime example of this, so I'm in the life sciences. Prime example is the student who started as a pre-med major, and found, maybe they did an internship early on, and they just found that they didn't like it. They didn't like working in that setting or something like that. That sounds negative, but important, and it would have been important in that student's case because it was because of that experience that they decided to go a different route and to pursue in ecology, let's say. So that actually was a positive experience. Positive in the sense that the student learned something about themselves, their motivations, their passions as a result of that experience. So that's not a negative experience, and it's certainly a valid thing to say, okay? Experiences are only negative if you don't learn anything from them. And I think that most of us have experiences like that, well, they might seem like they're negative, or might seem like failures. As long as you present them as things that were impactful, that you learned from and you grew as a person, then they're perfectly great and in fact valuable to include. And I like this quote from Henry Ford: "Life is a series of experiences, each one of which makes us bigger, even though sometimes it's hard to realize this. We must let the setbacks and grieves which we endure help us in our marching onward." So what I'm going to suggest here, and this gets at one of the questions I think that was mentioned earlier, how do you decide which research to highlight in your personal statement? As a starting point, before you start writing your statement, I'm going to suggest a couple of exercises for you to do. The first of these is your research experiences. Make a list of each project that you were involved with. Note down what your role was. Were you collecting data? Were you analyzing data? Did you come up with a methodology? Did you end up being a co-author on a paper or a co-presenter at a meeting, a talk, or a poster? So just get those sort of details down, that set of details. How those projects might connect to the research that you're going to propose. So they may have involved a particular set of skills that you learned in those previous experiences that you will now be using in your graduate research. And then what you're going to be doing is telling the reader only about the research to explain why it was important, what you learned from it. Again, it's not so much the research and, this isn't about the research findings from a previous experience. It's all personal. Everything here in this statement is about you. Tell us what you did and why it was important to you. What did you learn about in terms of skills? What did you learn about yourself? You like working in a lab. You hated working in the lab. You like working in the field. You hated working in the field. Help us. This all is going to help us explain or understand why you're in the field that you are and using the research that you are. So it might look like something like this. So you have a grid so maybe there was a project on Drosophila genetics. You were a lab tech. You got some bench skills. There was no outcome that you worked with, which is fine. But maybe what did you learn from it? In this case, didn't enjoy being a tech, really wasn't intellectually challenging. Moving on, here's another experience, a field assistant, and the person got some skills on self-sufficiency and some field skills, gave a presentation at a national meeting, recognized that they learned about themselves, that they enjoyed the problem-solving piece, and just simply became more self-confident. Here's another one. Now they were a project lead. They learned how to design the project. They co-authored a paper and so on, okay? So I suggest you take some time to do something like this, where you're making a list of your experiences, research experiences, your role, the skills you learned, their outcome, and so on, all right? So that's one step. Meanwhile, Jasmine asks, if you're getting your master's and PhD in the same program and didn't apply for the NSF fellowship during your master's, can you then apply while a PhD student? You can only apply for an NSF up until your third semester as a graduate student, okay? Once you've completed 2 years of graduate experience, you're no longer eligible unless you are changing disciplines entirely. And I mean entirely. So if you have a master's in divinity and now you're going to get a PhD in aerospace or something like that, but you have to go to NSF and basically get permission from them to apply once you've had that longer graduate experience, and they would only allow it if you're really starting over in essence. Is there data on percentage of overall fellowships available divided by industry discipline? You can actually go onto the NSF website and download a list of all of the recipients from this past competition, this past year. And that lists the institution and the discipline they're in. It does not, yeah, so that would, I think, answer that question. And then there's a question, what is the best way to approach a professor about wanting to write a fellowship proposal together? That's really important. When we get to this part of the research statement, I'm going to give you what I hope is a lot of useful advice on how to do a personal statement. I will touch on some of the elements of the research statement, but it's very hard to write a proposal without a fact being involved and helping you with the research statement. So the easiest way is if you are a current graduate student and just approach your major professor and indicate that you're interested in applying, and would your major professor help you, help read drafts. If I don't know if we have some undergraduate students on today, but if we do, I would just say approach member who you've worked with, let them know, and that's especially easy if you're thinking of applying to graduate school here. But even if you're not, many faculty are willing to assist you. So just approach them respectfully, but I think many faculty would be open. Okay, so that was your research experiences. Make a list of those. Now, there are the non-research experiences, and these are equally important in many ways. And again, you want to help the reader see how these events are critical to your decision to be here in graduate school or to be in graduate school. And again, a key component to this is the self-reflection. What did you learn yourself as a result of this event, just as I indicated for the research experiences? And again, you don't have a lot of space in these statements, so you're only tell enough about that event to help the reader understand why it's relevant, why it was important, part of your life and your path to get to graduate school. And so do a similar kind of thing, non-research experience, why that's relevant to your decision, graduate degree, and then your self-reflection. So as I mentioned, a possibility, interned in a hospital, convinced the person not to pursue a career as a surgeon, realized the hospital environment was not for them. Sorry to be giving the medical profession a hard time. It was a convenient example to use. Then a student psychology course, got them thinking about an alternate career path. Really just like the complex interactions that are inherent to ecology and the broad concepts. Could have been a vacation, right? Just a vacation to prove, but became motivated to be thinking about work in the tropics and so on. So think about these. Again, it's not major experience in your life. It has to be something that is relevant to your decision to a graduate career. Now, what you'll find once you have these two lists is that probably there's going to be more here than you can include in a statement. So then it's a question of prioritizing. All right. So for the research experiences, a student asked whether to include their master's work or their previous graduate work in another institution. You have to decide to look at that table and see the skills you learned and the self-reflection about yourself. If you don't actually have a lot to say about some of those experiences, then those are experiences you can comfortably leave off. right? But and similarly, if you have two research experiences that actually have led to learning sets of skills and the self-reflection are very, very similar, then you might just choose one and then just briefly mention that you had this other experience, but to show the breadth of your experience without actually spending much time talking about it. But the goal of these lists is to help you, one, have a menu of options, and then to give you a method to prioritize those. And it may be that as you start writing, you'll find you don't have enough space and you're going to have to drop off one of the ones you had hoped to write about. Hopefully this way of listing it will help you make an informed decision about what to include and what not to include. So one way about everything I'm saying is, this is, many of you probably have heard the phrase the elevator speech. This is where you've just stepped onto an elevator and somebody really important steps on there with you. Member of the Board of Regents, I don't know, department chair, a potential employer, whomever it might be. And you've got 3 floors of time to make an impression, right? You've got 30 seconds. What are you going to say? And in this particular context, let's say the person says, so I hear you're pursuing a PhD in your discipline. Why'd you do that? What I'm trying to describe for you is how you would answer that question. All right? And so this may help you think about it. And it's not just the elevator speech, right? It's, you might be in meetings with your, going back to home, and you're seeing friends from high school or undergraduate friends. What would you tell them about your decision to this? Maybe this is just, a casual conversation. It's a family. There are many opportunities for you to sort of experiment with what led you to decide to attend graduate school. And in many ways, that's what your personal statement is all about, is explaining what made you decide to do this. What's your motivation? What were those key events in your life? And the reason I keep referring to events, I think that occasionally students pursue a graduate degree because they did very, very well in undergrad, and a faculty member said, you should consider going to graduate school. Well, that's not a great reason that doesn't let me know as a reviewer or as a reader that this is really passionate about. Your statement has to convince me that you've made a conscious decision on your own based on these life experiences to pursue a graduate degree. That's what I want to see in a personal statement. Okay, so quick summary, and we can see if there are any questions about the personal statement. It's personal, make it about you. You have to be the focus of the statement. Don't shy away from including what might appear to be negative events. Typically, those are the ones that actually cause you to really rethink what you were doing and to make a conscious decision to go in a different direction. So then I'd ask you to make a list of your career-shaping research events and your career-shaping non-research events, prioritize those. And then you might, before you start writing, you still haven't started writing anything yet, think about how you might use those 2 lists to develop an elevator speech, and just try it out on family or friends and see how that feels. I'm going to maybe go back to a question that was asked earlier about, I forget how it was phrased. I think how not to come across as too overconfident and so on. This might be a version of it. I think some people, when writing, feel that they have to be really convincing, use a lot of jargon, use language that you might not normally use. My recommendation to you is, this is a personal statement. Read, after you do start writing, read some of what you've written out. If it feels uncomfortable to you to read it out loud, then you're using the wrong language. Okay? This should be pretty conversational. We're trying to get to know who you are. And if you use language that you're not used to using in speech, I don't mean about writing now. If this is not language you would normally use in speech in that elevator conversation, then I would suggest changing it in general. Okay, are there additional questions? I think I've addressed most of what's been forwarded to me. Let me give you a moment or two to chat some questions if you have them, again, about the personal statement. Oh, I will suggest, I don't think I included this later in the presentation. Writing, almost everybody finds it difficult. And there are some tricks that I will suggest to you. First, that first paragraph in your personal statement is really, really important. It sets the tone, and first impressions are important. So I frequently suggest that you think of maybe 3 different ways to start, conceptual ways, if you will, of starting your personal statement, and write 3 completely different introductory paragraphs, and then share those with other people and see how they react to them. Okay, that's a pretty good way, because once you start writing and once you have that first paragraph, that will constrain the way you write the rest of it. And so if you start off in something that isn't ideal, it'll be hard for you to write a great proposal. So try 3 different starts, 4 different starts, whatever. Share it with others and see what's successful. Another trick is that people, what you'll find is you have now a paragraph that you've written, and you know what point you're trying to make, and it's just not working. It's really hard, and you're just been editing that same paragraph for a while. My recommendation there is to set that paragraph aside, make sure you have clearly in your mind what you hope to accomplish with the paragraph, the points you want to make, and then write it from scratch. Most people will find that it actually flows pretty quickly at that point, but you are so bound by the words you had initially put down that editing them just is getting you nowhere. Okay, meanwhile, let's see. Do you recommend mentioning your identity in your personal statement? For instance, being a woman and a person of color in STEM and feeling like you want to represent that group as part of the reason for you want to go to grad school. The quick answer, if that's part of the reason you want to go to grad school, then you absolutely should mention it, right? So that's the point. Why are you going to graduate school? What is it that you're hoping to accomplish? What has motivated you? As long as the answer that who you are, your identity, is an important part of why you are pursuing a degree, then absolutely you should mention it, okay? I think that if, again, the test is, when it's read, is it clear why this statement is relevant to your decision to go to graduate school? If it's not, it doesn't belong there. That's my simple, quick answer. Is perceived motivation one of the most important criteria for reviewers to evaluate the personal statement? I think so. I think that, and I should say, remember this, I have been a reviewer for NSF for many years. I've talked to many other reviewers, but this is still my impression. Take everything up somewhat of a grain of salt. It's an informed advice, but I can't speak for every reviewer. I believe that motivation is critically important, because remember what we're doing is trying to evaluate what we believe your potential is as a scholar, your potential to be successful. And if you come across as being highly motivated, I'm automatically more inclined to think that you're going to be successful. Okay? If you come across as very proud of your past accomplishments and listing all these great accomplishments, but there's no indication of why you want to do this, then it doesn't matter how successful you've been in the past. I'm skeptical that you're going to pursue this successfully. So motivation, I think, is critically important. The library database for other opportunities doesn't work. I'm yeah, I worried about this when I put it up there. I'm guessing, Athena, and if you could follow up, that you might be at Minnesota Duluth. I think that that library resource may only be available to Twin Cities graduate students, but I'm not sure. I checked the URL earlier today, and it seemed to work for me. But if you could confirm whether that's the issue or not, and let me know. Maya says, how do we tactfully disclose instances where GPA academic performance was lower than typical? Thank you. That's a great question. This is that category of the red flag. Okay, if there is something that you think is in your transcript or will be in your letters or whatever that might be something that a reviewer would be concerned about, my advice is highlight it and tell them why it's not only not something to be concerned about, but it's a strength. And let me give you an example. So I had actually an undergraduate student take my proposal writing course many years ago. And he told me, asked a very similar question. He told me that he, as an undergrad, had basically flunked out. I mean, he majored in having a good time in his freshman year as an undergrad, and didn't really know why he was in school. Fundamentally, he wasn't really motivated, and so he flunked out. He left a year, and then he went and worked for a while. Figured out what his motivation was, and he came back and had a 4.0 following that in a very demanding discipline. But he was, how do I talk about this? And I said, this is perfect. Explain. This is evidence of motivation, right? This is evidence that this is a student who really figured out what he wanted to do, why he wanted to do it. Once he was motivated, he was doing great, and just own up to the fact that he lacked the motivation early in his career. And he did that. He got an NSF. He just recently graduated with a from Yale. So I think addressing what might be points of concern, explain to them why they shouldn't be concerned about it, honestly, and where possible, as this student did, explain why, in fact, it's evidence of strength. Nicoletta says, I think you didn't go over the main criteria you mentioned in a summary. I'm not sure. I think you're talking about, about intellectual merit and broader impacts, those criteria, I believe, and that's the next step. No, it's not the next step. I'm going to talk about a research plan, and then I'll come back to this. For the most part, the two criteria are going to be used to evaluate both statements, but let me come back to that once I get through the research plan. So again, the research plan statement is helping reviewers evaluate you as a scholar and potential. They're only looking at the research statement as evidence of that, not as a particular project they're going to fund. So the research plan statement, my advice to you, and again, there's limits to how much advice I can give you here because it can be so variable between disciplines. But the general recommendation is make sure that you state the overarching big pictures. Start big. So let me give you an example. So I mentioned that I studied birds and bird evolution. When my own students were applying for NSF, I did not want them to mention birds at all in the first paragraph. That would have narrowed it too quickly, right? The first paragraph should be about, in our case, evolutionary biology and big questions in evolutionary biology. And it's only in the second or third paragraph that you get into the actual study system that is going to be used. If you start with the study system, it automatically says the implications are narrow, or that's what it seems like. Okay, so try to stay at that 30,000 foot level. Many disciplines require hypotheses as part, that's an expectation. So if you need to know that, make sure to faculty in your discipline. But if hypotheses are expected, then you must include them. It's sort of a complete non-starter for many who expect to see hypotheses and they're not presented, or they're presented improperly. Okay, so and ideally, it's not just testing one hypothesis, but they're actually alternatives that you're trying to test so that you can select amongst them. That's the ideal. Clearly state the objectives of the research, and then indicate why the system, in the case I was just mentioning, birds, the system in which you're going to do your study is ideal to answer those questions, and why the University of Minnesota as an institution, assuming that you're a grad student here, is an ideal place to conduct that research. All right, so those are some topics to do. And the way to think about the structure is sort of, and this is a classic in writing, is sort of what's termed the hourglass proposal structure. And it's the idea that you start at the beginning, placing your research in as broad a context as you possibly can, because you want to appeal to as many readers as you want. And this is true not just for proposals, but when you're writing things for publication, you want as broad an audience to be interested in and to read your work as possible. So start broad, appeal to as broad an audience as possible. Then give the specifics of your research, the hypothesis to be tested, the study system, the design, the methodology. And this gets back to an earlier question about how much detail to have about methodology. You want to communicate just enough detail to convince them that you know what you're doing, that you're knowledgeable about the literature, about the methodologies, that you have the skills, and that the project is basically feasible. The research proposal, the research plan statement is only 2 pages long. It's not a lot of space. So that's what you want, is to just convince them with enough detail that you know how to design a study, that you know how to, the right methodologies, the right forms of analyses, and so on, and that it's appropriate to the questions that you're asking. And then you want to end by bringing it back out to that broader audience and reminding them of the implications of this work. Because inevitably, remember, for most of us, the actual research we do is pretty specific, right? It's a small study system, narrowly defined, a particular set of questions, so on. And so the project itself might be relatively narrow. You have to remind them that that may be a narrow, small question, but the implications are very broad, okay? So that's your challenge. So the other elements that you need to include, you have to specify that the project is your idea, that you were involved, all right? In some disciplines, there's a tendency for students to be handed a project. NSF is not as interested in hearing about that. Again, that's because they're not funding the project, they're funding you. They want to know that you have the ability to generate project ideas. You have to convince the reader the project is feasible. So if you're talking about using this really large data set that's already in existence, then you're going to need to tell them, to convince them that you have been given access to that data set. If your project requires the use of some very expensive piece of equipment, you need to that you have access to that equipment, and so on, okay? You want to reassure them that you yourself are capable. So the project might be feasible, but beyond that, they need to know that you're able to do this. And so that's one of the goals of your research plan statement, is to convince them. And remember, you actually have 2 statements. You have that personal plan. So part of this may be making sure that in the personal statement, you've made sure that they understand that you've already, through your prior research experience, accumulated the skills that are going to be needed in your research project, assuming that that's the case. If you make that statement in your personal statement, then you can simply refer to it in your research plan statement. And it should appeal to somebody who's a specialist in your area as well as a non-specialist. Remember what I said earlier. Imagine that you're going to have reviewers who span somebody who's a specialist to somebody who's in your faculty member in your graduate program who's really very distant from your own specialty. Okay. So that was quick because, again, you're going to have to work with a faculty advisor on this. But the issue is the structure. Make sure you start from that broad perspective, get into the details, and then including hypotheses, but then end with a reminder that this really has much broader appeal. So the next step, I'll talk about intellectual merit and broader impacts. But are there any questions about the research plan statement before I proceed? And again, you can ask questions at any time. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to proceed, but don't hesitate to continue if you're already writing a chat to do so. So NSF evaluates proposals on these two criteria, intellectual merit and broader impacts. And broader impacts is the one that confuses everybody. Intellectual merit is really the nature of your research experience, right? The skills that you've developed and the intellectual decisions you've made that got you to apply to and get to graduate school. And then within your statement, just the way you framed the question, that you designed a project, that it's hypothesis-based, if that's important in your discipline, that you've got the right methodology. So all that counts as sort of as the intellectual merit. And that's mostly what I think you've been hearing me talk about. The broader impacts is the one that is really new for most people. So NSF defines it this way. Broader impacts criterion encompasses the potential to benefit society and contribute to the achievement of specific desired societal outcomes. So basically, the idea here is, what are the impacts that you have had and will have outside of your discipline, outside of sort of the scholarly environment? So NSF defines broader impacts in this way: promoting teaching and training, broadening participation of underrepresented groups, enhancing infrastructure, enhancing scientific and technological understanding, again, not within your own discipline, but more broadly, and then benefiting society. And so let me explain to you why NSF does this, why this has become important. So the traditional view of a scholar is that you're going to do your own scholarship and you're going to publish, and other scholars will read those, and then they'll publish, and then you'll read those. And basically, there's a closed community of scholarship that is self-fulfilling and so on. And if you're an academic, if you're a faculty member, then you're also conveying your research through your teaching to students. But then there are all these other people: policymakers, agencies, educators, writers, non-government organizations, and voters, who actually are consumers of scholarship. But traditionally, they had to do that on their own. Right? Policymakers had to reach in and look at the literature. Agencies had to look at the literature and do that themselves. NSF is hoping to change that. And so NSF's view is more like this: that yes, we still have our scholarly community, but they really want scholars to take an active role in interpreting scholarship to the broader, to students, to all of these educators and so on, and voters generally. That it isn't enough to be in our ivory tower and talk to each other, that we need to communicate, all right? And so that's why NSF has this criterion. They want to know that you have potential not just to be a productive scholar, but a productive scholar who communicates, and that you're interested in that, okay? So another thing that's important for you to recognize as you start to write these proposals is NSF's view of broader impacts is very broad. But and NSF trains reviewers, but that doesn't necessarily mean that reviewers pay attention to the training. Um, so even though there's training, some reviewers have pretty narrow definition of broader impacts, and it's specifically about underrepresented communities. So what I will tell you is that, and I think this is good advice regardless, where possible, if you have had experience of this broader impacts nature with underrepresented communities, make sure you highlight that. If you are interested in working with underrepresented communities in the future, I suggest you make sure you highlight that, right? Because I guarantee all reviewers that I'm aware of value communicating scholarship to underrepresented and involving and motivating members of underrepresented communities. So it's important to do. That is not NSF's view. It doesn't have to be those communities only, but I wanted you to recognize that. The other piece of advice I have, since many of you are current graduate students and have teaching assistant experience, that is not particularly valuable as an example of broader impacts. While it is, to some extent, you're communicating scholarship, especially if it's a non-majors course. The issue is that you're being paid to do that, so that doesn't speak to motivation. It doesn't tell me that this is something that you're passionate about. It could well be that you did it because you needed the paycheck. All right, so it's not a compelling example of motivation to be involved in broader impacts. So your opportunities, and here we are, we're in the spring. If you're applying this fall, you have many months yet to write this proposal. You also have many months to get involved in broader impacts if you haven't been in the past. And I highly recommend that you do that. So opportunities exist here in the Twin Cities, the Bell Museum. There's a Children, Youth, and Family Consortium. There's a STEM readiness program, Teaching Spark. There's a variety of things on campus. The Swenson College has a variety of outreach at UMD, and there are others at UMD as well. And then there are always extra opportunities, museums, nature centers, working with local schools. Duluth, the Great Lakes Aquarium would be a good example. So there are many opportunities involved, and I would encourage you to talk to graduate students in your graduate program about what experiences they've had in broader impacts, and you might learn of some great opportunities that way. So just as I had you do, suggest you do for your research experiences and your non-research major career impactful experiences, I'd have you make a list of your prior broader impacts experiences in the same way. What was it? What skills were learned? What was the outcome? I didn't mention it here. I probably should have. Who was the audience? Can be important. And importantly, as always, what did you learn about yourself? What did you learn about yourself and your own interest in engaging in broader impacts activities? Could have been a biology tutor as an undergrad. Skills you learned, who was involved, what did you get out of it? Could be a volunteer center, could be mentoring, it could be any number of things. But do think about this. And it doesn't, one thing that can be confusing is broader impacts isn't necessarily about communicating the precise research project. So again, I'm in evolutionary biology. I've given presentations to elementary school classes on birds, just on birds generally, not on my particular research. That's broader impacts. Okay? It doesn't have to be specific to your research project. So in summary of this section, you're going to make a list, and then what NSF wants you to do is include in both of those statements, the personal statement and the research statement, a section on broader impacts, all right? And ideally, I think they actually say now that there should be a subhead identified for broader impacts. So, so in your personal statement, there should be something about these kinds of events in your life, these experiences you've had, broader impacts, and what that means about your future plans for involvement in broader impacts like activities. And then for your research statement, what do you intend to, basically that's a place where you can talk about what you intend to do as a graduate student, and maybe even as a researcher engaged in broader impacts. When you talk about your future plans, one example I've seen is I'm going to put together a blog about this topic. If you already have done that, then that's pretty believable, and I have reason to believe it's going to happen. If you suggest you're going to do something that you haven't started doing yet, and it's could be complicated, it's now you have to convince me that this is something that's really going to happen. So in many ways, plugging into either getting started now on something or plugging into something like a museum where they have confidence that this event, this activity can happen because the logistics have already been worked out, could be quite helpful. And again, you can refer to broader impact universal statement in addition to where you have it as a separate subheading. If that makes sense to do, that makes it more compelling that you truly are motivated to be involved in broader impacts. And lastly, as I said, if you don't have that experience, I really encourage you to go get some. Any questions about this section? And I know we're getting short on time because we've had questions throughout, so don't hesitate to ask them. I'm just going to go on to the letters of reference section. This can be confusing as well. I mentioned that you're going to have 3 letters. You actually have the opportunity to identify 5 letter writers. And the reason for this is NSF will only look at 3, and you rank them. But if one of your top 3 letter writers doesn't get their letter in on time, then they will use your first backup. And if that person isn't in, or if 2 of your letter writers didn't get in, then this way you're set and you'll have 3 letter writers. If for whatever reason you only had 2 people get in on time by the deadline that NSF provides, then they will not review your proposal. Okay, so you must have 3 letters. So that's the reason for having these backups. So you need to identify the strongest letter writers you can, and you need to then prioritize them. Please do not tell your letter writers how you're prioritizing them, right? They don't need to get into that. You need to tell NSF so they know which letters are going to be used. Jennifer mentions that she couldn't get into the Canvas site. Oh, the Canvas, the archive, you all need to go through that process of asking for permission in order to, to fill out that online form. And then once you've done that, Tony will give you access to the Canvas site. The proposal were given to us with the understanding that they were confidential and they would be limited to people taking workshops like this. So you need to go through that process. Maddie asks, how much can or should you share your passion for challenging the system in your broader impact, such as dismantling systems that exclude people? As I tried to say before, this is about, this needs to be an honest statement. This needs to be your motivations. And if your motivations to do this are to increase access, then say that. That's part of your motivation. And I can tell you, as a reviewer and as somebody who knows a lot of reviewers, I think that that's very compelling. We need to understand why you want to do this. And the more we see that, the more convinced we are that you're going to be that agent of change that society needs. So I'd say for sure. And yes, Duluth students will have access to the Canvas sites. All you need to do is fill out that permission form, that confidentiality form that I showed at the beginning. The question I have on Duluth is that issue about library access to that to the Foundation search tool, and I'll look into that. Let's see. Phoebe asks, can you use non-science broader impact related activities as evidence? Yes, you can. I think that in general, the stronger examples of broader impacts are ones that are closer to whatever discipline you're now in. But if you don't have those, or not very many of them, then it's fine to use, you were a tutor in English and you're now a science major. What I recommend is that you really emphasize what you learned about the broader impacts process and the rewards associated with that personally, right? So what you learned from it, what you found motivational about it. It's less about what you were conveying and more about what you learned about the process, what you about yourself. I hope that helps. It also doesn't have to be in the US too. I think I've had a number of people who have done really interesting things in Latin America while they were an undergraduate student or even as a high school student, and working with a local community and communicating complex ideas. That's great. Okay. Broad question. How might we approach topics, activities, engagement, things that have been canceled due to COVID? Obviously, we have other experiences, but I imagine some of us have missed professional outreach opportunities over the last few months and or the future months. So again, I would say that's in that category of negative experiences. I would hope that for many of you, what you have or what you've learned this semester is how much you miss doing what you were doing before. Hopefully you've been able to continue to do some great things. But I suspect many of you could say that you've learned just how much you doing what you were doing and how much you miss being able to do it in that particular way. So I think it's relevant. I think maybe this is an opportunity to say, many of you have personal challenges that you can refer to, and COVID experiences may well fall into that. If you present hardships that you've overcome, that's appropriate to include as long as you can tie it to helping us understand why that influenced your decision to be in graduate school or how you're pursuing your graduate career. So that's fine, but it is important not to come across as though owed because of the difficulties that you've had to face in the past. That does not typically play well with reviewers. It's more that you want to present it as something that's very influential in your life and impactful in your life, but not come across as, and therefore you need to give me a fellowship because I overcame this hardship. That tends not to be a successful approach with NSF. Hava says, I thought the guiding principle for broader impact document linked to this blog post is really helpful. It's a 2-3-page PDF with some good examples. So, and she has, and that's been shared here, that URL. So I encourage you to take a look at that. We can probably include that in a follow-up if you don't see it. The slides in the presentation you should have received or will receive with these slides. We'll make sure that goes around. Okay, we're getting close here. Oh, you can't afford a weak letter. And why I say this is, imagine you worked in a lab of a really well-renowned scholar, but you never actually interacted with that person maybe more than once or twice, so they don't really know you. The fact that that person is impressive doesn't matter. They're not going to be able to write a strong letter for you because they don't know. This is all about you and your potential. So you'd be better off getting the letter from the postdoc, maybe, who was in that Zoom all the time. You want the letters to be from people who really know you. Now, there is one way around this. If you actually would love to have a letter from this one faculty member, but that person doesn't know you particularly well, but the postdoc in the lab does. The postdoc could write the letter, and the major professor or the professor and the postdoc could co-sign it. That might be a way of doing it too. But the letters have to be strong, right? It's, for the most part, and since only US students can apply for this, the culture in the United States is that reference letters are always strong. If you have a weak letter, it stands out. So for the most part, that's what you need to avoid. So what do you do? Tell your references about the program. Make sure that they have a link to NSF. They understand what it's all about. You want them to talk about your prior experiences, your current research, and your broader experiences. And it's very likely that no one reviewer can do all of that. So as you choose the reviewers the people to write your reviews, make sure that collectively they can address this. The other thing is, and this is something that most people are unaware of, is tell them what you want them to write. They don't have to write it, but tell them what that you want them to write about, and remind them in some cases. So there's a question here about, can you have a letter from a previous outside of your current institution? Absolutely. You want the strongest letters. It doesn't matter where they're coming from. The exception to that is if you're currently in graduate school, it's odd if you don't have any letters from your current institution. So that's the one caveat I would say there. So absolutely have letters from people from previous institutions. They have to be the strongest letters you can get. If you do ask somebody who you interacted with some years ago, what you might want to do is also remind them who you are. And what I mean by that is tell them in asking them to write for you, one, make sure that they get drafts of your proposal. That'll help them. But also remind them that, oh, remember, I worked in I'd like you to write a letter for me because I really found the experience valuable when I worked in your lab fall of 2017. And I really enjoyed learning this and working with so-and-so. Remember, they're probably interacting with lots of students. Help them to remember what you did, what your role was. It'll help them the best letter possible. NSF is a deadline for the letters to be in. I guarantee you that you will be stressed out because you'll see whether the letter is in or not. And it can get very stressful as that deadline approaches. I would encourage you to tell them that you would like them to get their letter in a week earlier than that. And as long as they do that, then you can be relaxed. And if not, then that entire week that gotten it in, but the deadline is still out there, you can periodically check in with them and remind them that it's due. So identify letter writers, tell them what you would like them to write about, and give them that deadline a little bit earlier. I'm going to race through this with you. I really encourage you to put together writing groups. And if you're interested, you could email gsfellow at umn.edu. And we will see, Tony will see about assembling some groups of 3 or 4 of you that would be interested. And it's really helpful to share your writing every week. Just constantly set some dates for sharing drafts. You get those responses. It's also the accountability of that when you're working with a group. Get feedback on those drafts. It's important to do because one, you have to get used to allowing other people to read your drafts. You have to learn how to accept feedback gracefully. And it's an important skill also to know how to give constructive feedback. But please, if you do this, make sure you actually do it. If you sign up for a group and then don't do your part, it's really not helpful. So I really encourage you to start working in groups of people who really are planning on submitting this proposal. and to get going sooner rather than later. Now, something you're likely to encounter, both with small groups or getting feedback from faculty, whomever, is that you're likely to end up occasionally with advice that conflicts. So imagine that in my statement, I included the fact that I bailed from my first PhD program and left with a master's degree, which is true, by the way. One reviewer tells me that it's just too negative, and they suggest that I get rid of it, take it out of my proposal completely. Somebody else encourages me to include it in the proposal and suggests that I explain why it was such an important experience. So what should I do? One says remove it, one says expand upon it. So, just don't have a sort of a knee-jerk reaction to the advice, really examine it. And in this case, the primary point is that both of them don't like what I wrote, right? So doing nothing is really not an option here. The second point is that both agree that what I've written is too negative, okay? The only real disagreement is whether to delete it entirely or to expand upon it and make it more positive. So what do you do? My general suggestion, I mean, you could just, especially if you're in a hurry, just choose one solution and move on. I think the best thing is to try both. Try writing the proposal in both ways and then share that with your small, see how they react to it, okay? That I really encourage you to submit proposals to multiple agencies or foundations. Just make sure if you do that, that you change the proposal, all right? Don't just cut the entire proposal, because the audience has just changed, and you always have to be thinking about the audience. Your goal really is to make this whole thing written in a way that it makes it as easy as possible for the reviewer to fund you. And recognize that as a reviewer, I really want to fund people, right? I mean, I'm going through all this trouble with this proposal. So in many ways, every proposal starts as a fund for me, right? I really hope this is funded. And then as I read it, if it's poorly organized, poorly written, whatever, then it convinces me not to support funding it. The proposal's got to work together so that it really has to feel like the research statement makes sense relative to the personal statement. So if the personal statement were all about molecular biology, and then the research statement about a research program in history, it makes no sense to me as a reviewer. Help me those two documents need to work very well together. All right. Okay. Work with the writing group. Listen to advice, but don't blindly follow it. Make an educated guess. Make sure that you are writing for the audience, know the audience, and just recognize that that's your goal. Your goal is to make it easy for reviewers to find you. So I managed to get through it in 3 minutes over. I apologize. Obviously, people who need to jump off, many have already, that's perfectly fine, but I'm happy to stay on and answer a few more questions. Maddie asked, should all your letters be from people at academic institutions? No, that's not necessary. Again, it has to be relevant. They have to be able to talk relevantly about these areas. So as long as you have one or two people who are going to write letters who really know about your research experience and your potential as a scholar, then having somebody from an educational center who really understands you in a broader impacts capacity is perfectly fine. The one caveat is that if you're asking somebody to write a letter for you who's not an academic institution, they may not be familiar with writing letters like this, and certainly not for NSF. So make sure you've given them the information they need to write the letter that you need, okay? So there was a question about resources for fellowships for international students. Again, I would suggest the best way is to look both at the grad school website for what's available there, but especially That library resource that was in one of the first slides, that includes fellowship opportunities globally. It's probably not comprehensive, but it's really, really good. Okay, tell us a little bit more about what the reviewer process is like. Are you given a target number and just say, okay, so the way it works is every proposal will be read by 3 reviewers, and it's you could end up with 3 reviewers who are actually from your specific subdiscipline. You could end up with no reviewers from your subdiscipline. They're from the larger, the larger discipline. So you don't know that. No way to predict. We are asked to provide a ranking on both intellectual merit and then on broader impacts. And we are asked basically to provide a numeric score ranking for them, not rank 1 through whatever, but an actual score for each proposal. And then we actually do some work to normalize those so that some reviewers only give, really good scores, relatively short, small range of scores. Others give a very large range. So those are adjusted so that they're more comparable. And then those scores, proposals are ranked by those scores, and each sort of discipline, NSF has decided on average how many proposals they expect to fund from that particular group. And so we've ranked all the evolution proposals, let's say, using my example, and they'll tell us, oh, the top 20 are going to be funded. And so then we look at the list and we discuss we also discuss any proposals where review wildly different. So if 2 reviewers thought that was a great proposal, but another one thought it was terrible, then those 3 reviewers actually talk, and then they have an opportunity to adjust their scores based on what they've told each other. And then ultimately, one of the great things about NSF, and another thing I would suggest everybody apply for it, is you will get comments back. You will get comments from all 3 of your reviewers about how they ranked it. You don't get the numerical score, but you will be told what they liked and didn't like, any suggestions that they have. The other thing to know about NSF is that basically there's a group of about 2,000 people each year who get fellowships. And the details of that I glossed over, but if you're not familiar, that's 3 years of funding. And it doesn't matter whether you're a master's or a PhD student, you would get 3 years of funding. If you don't get an award, you might get an honorable mention. And I can tell you from my experience, if you get an honorable mention, you should definitely put that on your CV, because that means your proposal was pretty much as good as those who got funded. You just had the luck of the draw. I mean, to me, it's not obvious what the differences are between an honorable mention proposal and a funded proposal. They're all quite strong. There's just not enough money. So recognize that that's what you'll get. So everybody will get comments, and you will hear, so you submit end of October, early November, and you'll hear April 1st. Is it okay to have a letter from someone who's a leader in the school district, which is who I work with? Yes. So again, there's no real constraint on who the reviewers are. They just need to be able to write a compelling letter. They need to know you. They need to be able to write a strong letter. And the only thing, as I mentioned earlier, you don't want to be in a situation where none of your reviewers can talk as a scholar about your research and your research potential. You need at least one faculty member, I think, to do that. The other constraint I would say is that if you are currently in graduate school, it's really typically to have at least one letter from your institution, ideally from your major professor, if you have one, from your advisor. Otherwise, it's sort of one of those red flags, and you'd need to explain why you didn't have somebody. Any other questions? So I'm back. I was going to try to actually be able to show up on camera periodically, but it was too complicated to do. So really, if there are any other questions, don't hesitate to contact me. If they occur to you subsequently, you might send those on to GS Fellow as well. I encourage you to do one of these proposals, and I encourage you further that once you've done that, to think about and look for other foundations or agencies you could apply to. So thanks, everybody. I hope you're doing well and during these unusual times. Take care.